Well, thank you so much for having me come and speak to you guys today. When Betty asked me to come, I was honored. I will go anywhere that Betty wants me to go and do anything that Betty wants me to do. So
I'm writing that one.
I know you are. So this was sort of pitched to me like, come and talk with students who are interested in the arts, and in some ways interested in this bigger life question of how do I take all the things that I'm learning in this thoughtful and supportive atmosphere. Hi, Susan, come in and sit down. Help yourself to food. And how do I get from point A to point B? So I figured I would spend some time talking about just that, what that looked like, since career paths are so personal, and sharing any information I can about that trajectory. And then talk about the foundation at Joyce, the work that we do, spend some time specifically talking about the culture program that I run, and maybe demystify foundations a little bit. Because certainly before I started working at a foundation, I had a lot of misperceptions of what really happens inside of them. And then I thought I could share, after a year and a half in, what some of these questions are that I'm asking myself, the kind of big conundrums that I'm emerging with after my short time at the foundation world. So I want to also have a conversation and have it be a dialogue. So if there's anything that you want to ask in the middle or don't understand or take issue with, feel free to raise your hand and we can start a conversation about it. Or you can wait till the end and then we can also dialogue some. Part of the reason I want to raise some of the questions I have about the field is that I think, you know, perhaps you guys have some new thinking which could really inform the foundation world as well. So I really want to invite you to share some of the thoughts that you have about the arts. So first, I just want to know exactly kind of who's in the room. How many of you are currently students at the University of Chicago? Is it the majority? Are you mostly graduate students? Okay. And how many of you work for nonprofit organizations? Okay, and there's overlap there too. How many of you are here for a grant today? Because I have cash, so I thought I could make it rain after my presentation. All right, so I'm going to actually address that a little bit later under the misperceptions of foundation officers portion of my speech. So I think I'll start with me. As Betty mentioned, I've worked at the foundation for a year and a half now. And I really started my career when I was putting myself through graduate school at the School of the Art Institute. And I was getting an MFA. And I took a part-time job at a company that was called Marshall Fields. Is it okay if I move? Okay. That's now Macy's. And it was a part-time job just doing administrative stuff. And I pretty quickly realized that, you know, this job, while it was totally outside of my realm of study, that there was a lot that I was learning from this space, this business world, where there's so much structured communication around projects and goals of projects, where you are in terms of cadence, and then, you know, once it's executed, the post-mortem that follows. And I realized then, and I still think today, that there's so much that the art world could learn from that structured communication of the business world. But I started working and decided to sort of bring my full self with me to work. So I remember being asked to make copies of things, and I would always read whatever I was copying. And it was the Public Affairs Department of Marshall Fields, so there was grants that were being made at that time to arts organizations. And I started to put Post-it notes with my recommendations of funding on the copies before I turned them in. And that could have gone either way, you know. But luckily, I had a boss who thought it was amusing and challenged me on my recommendations and asked me, you know, what the financials looked like and what the project narrative was about and what were the metrics and how did the last grant go, and began what is really a mentor-mentee relationship. And I think that that's a little bit more formalized today, but at that time that was, for me at least, a new concept that someone could really take pleasure out of educating me about the unseen chess game that's being played within any institution, really. And this person literally brought me to her home one day for pizza and gave me my first business suits because I was in art school. You know, I had like cat eye rhinestone glasses and I was walking around barefoot a lot in the office. So she really helped me with the sort of details on the unsaid that is a big part of making your way through this career. So I highly always recommend mentors inside a space and outside of a space. That mentorship actually, for me, turned into the first part of my career because Marshall Fields was owned by Target Corporation. At the time, it was later sold. But that mentorship led to promotions and new opportunities, and eventually I was living in Minneapolis and working for Target Corporation in the community relations department, and I started to, again, that sort of same copy room, going to read everything beyond my purview, really felt and feel like Target was this, you know, marketing guru genius, and that while I was there I wanted to learn as much as I could about that world. And what my main takeaway pretty early on was that marketing not only does a brilliant job talking about a product or a project, but has a deep understanding and respect for audience and how audiences like to be communicated with. And that feels like another major opportunity for the art world. And so the next space that I moved to was the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, as Betty mentioned. And you know, we were talking about this a little bit before I came in here, but it's such an interesting time in the art world. How many people are involved in the arts? Okay. So in this 21st century moment, art institutions often find themselves talking to the same audience. They find themselves talking to an older, white, affluent audience that is fading. And the other thing that's shifting is the experience or expectations of that audience. A lot of new audiences want something that's going to move from a 1.0 experience of we put things up on our wall, we put things on our stage, you come, you listen, you walk away, we're good, to one that does respect curatorial authority, but is more 2.0, is more dynamic and open, and there is the room to have a co-ownership of an institution and a dialogue about interpretation, and a dialogue that might even affect the programming of an institution. And this moment of trying to move between, and when I say this moment, I really mean this friction of trying to move between a sort of one-way communication to a dynamic conversation that involves artists and playwrights and directors and the inner machinations of institutions is an exciting time that the art world has not figured out but is struggling with. And so there's that. The other thing that I recognized in working in the arts was spending time in a museum, which is a wonderful place to work. It's amazing to develop a relationship with art over a period of months, to see it at night when no one is around and in the morning, and you sort of change your relationship to those works. I spent a lot of time in the galleries, and the audience that most art institutions attract do not reflect the communities that surround them. And when I say most institutions, I'm really talking about these sort of larger anchor legacy institutions. Now, when you look at community-based institutions, it's a totally different story. And yet, the artwork that's happening in those institutions is somehow not moving along in terms of being recognized as part of the canon of art history. So there's this disconnect between art with a capital A and art with a lowercase a. And really, it is a detriment to the entire art ecosystem. So this became a passion of mine when I was at the museum, because I realized it wasn't for lack of good intentions of these art institutions. So I co-founded a group called the Multicultural Arts Marketing Committee and worked with different arts administrators of color across the city. And who were all working on diversifying their own institution. And we began to try and tackle it together. That type of work, along with some innovative internal projects that I was able to work on, something called the Mark Bradford Project, which was with a phenomenal artist from LA named Mark Bradford, who worked with us over the course of the year. Again, sort of led me to the next space of the Joyce Foundation. So the Joyce Foundation, is anyone familiar with the Joyce Foundation? Okay, so I'm going to give you a description and talk about it in a way that's not really on our website, but is more like an informal, I'm having brunch with you and I'm telling you what I do with my life. So the Joyce Foundation is a really progressive foundation, and we fund in 6 different areas. 5 of them focus on public policy. We're really interested in leveling the playing field. That's sort of our raison d'etre. And we see that in different ways. We aim toward high quality of life for citizens, and we break that down into education, into environment, employment, democracy. We have a gun violence prevention program. Actually, there's an event that's happening tonight at the Institute of Politics that's going to really tackle gun policy with Tom Brokaw and with Mayor Emanuel. And our program officers are really subject matter experts in trying to move the needle in these different areas. The culture program is different because we don't focus on public policy, but we do try to level the playing field and move the needle in terms of racial equity in the arts. And so what does that mean? We break that down into 4 different buckets. And what I think will be most helpful is to talk about the bucket and then give an example of a grantee in that bucket. So we do something called Access, and that looks at these large legacy arts organizations that are predominantly of Eurocentric culture and predominantly attract white audience and are staffed predominantly by white individuals. And we work with them to diversify themselves from the inside out. So staff at all levels of the organization, board, the pipeline in, internships, development of new work by playwrights, the vibe of an organization, all those things that sort of go into the audience that it attracts, which is really sort of the internal operations. What we don't do is, if a big organization is going to present a Latino artist and wants to attract a Latino audience, and they come to Joyce and they say, we'd like you to fund that. We know you like brown people. That's not something we do. And it's actually a pretty complicated and nuanced conversation that we enter into, because we believe that, you know, this is for the betterment, not just of, this isn't like a civic duty. This is actually a business plan for arts organizations to make themselves relevant. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to my sort of questions in the field. The Goodman is a great example of a grantee that we've been funding for 20 plus years. They made a decision that they wanted diversity and inclusion to be a part of their mission. And so they've been in their new space like 10 or 11 years. They've produced 29 world premieres. 16 of them have been by playwrights of color, have featured actors of color or directors of color. They have a new playwrights program that is constantly developing playwrights of color. They pay their interns a living wage, which is a really big deal, and they work actively on board development. That said, they also acknowledge that there's a lot more that has to happen. They're not satisfied with their efforts. And so they're continually looking for theaters and residents that they can have that will help them to more intrinsically feel like an organization that reflects Chicago. The other category we have is called community-based arts. And that is where, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of arts organizations that are not downtown, that are staffed by people of color and sit in communities of color, and we do a lot of funding for these organizations in the realm of capacity building. And so a lot of what we do is pay salaries, kind of unsexy stuff in terms of the funding world. We might bring in a development consultant that can make a 5-year plan. We might help to strengthen the board. A really good example of a grantee in this area is actually at the University of Chicago. There is a program called the Southside Arts and Humanities Network. Are you guys familiar with this? Yeah, it's not actually that well known even at the university, but this is a fantastic, it's run by a woman named Joni Friedman. It's amazing, and what she has is 150 small to mid-sized arts organizations that are in the Southside Arts and Humanities Network that surround the university. And so for years, she's been convening folks and talking with them about how, you know, the university can help and how the university can learn. And a wonderful program was created 2 years ago where there's a class, it's offered at the Graham School of Continuing Studies that trains, it pulls from you guys, you University of Chicago folk, students, faculty, administrators, trains you on how to be great board members, and then does matchmaking and actually places you on the boards of these arts organizations for like the thrill of your life to be able to really be exposed to amazing work. So that's an example in that category. We have a category called creativity, and that's where our Joyce Awards falls. We commission new work from artists of color for $50,000, and it's in conjunction with an arts organization. In 2013, we changed our program for the 10th anniversary, so now any nonprofit organization can commission new work from an artist of color. The reason we made that change is really to empower the artist to initiate these type of relationships. So rather than waiting till they're codified by a museum, say, a community center can commission new work from an artist of color. A church can. And so what we're trying to do is follow artists where they are naturally working and do a little bit to erase that line between the big A and the little a. And then our final category is called innovation. And that was introduced a little shortly after I started. And I see that as like a test kitchen for new ideas. And right now we're looking at digital engagement and how that might lead to a broader, more diverse audience. A good example of that grantee is called an organization called the Black Women Playwrights Group. They operate out of Washington, D.C., and they're doing really interesting projects with a group of computer scientists at Carnegie Mellon, and they're creating cyber narratives around new plays. So that's our funding. And before I talk about any of the questions that I'm sort of lingering with, maybe I'll do a little bit of that demystification process. So I think, you know, as I kind of joked about earlier, but a misperception of this job is that I am somehow autonomous in decision making and am able to, you know, like an organization and give cash to that organization. And foundations are actually very strenuous and rigorous in terms of making sure that decisions are objective and are based on a preset strategy of what each program in that foundation in general is trying to achieve. So as I mentioned, At Joyce, we have these different program areas. Well, each of us as program officers set a 3-year strategy of how we see moving the needle in racial equity in the arts. And then we set benchmarks for ourselves in terms of how we think our organizations will be able to do that. And then we do our grant making, and I'll describe that process. But we really select organizations that we think can help round out making the biggest impact and change for the sector as a whole. So it isn't about who has a great project, because honestly, the most heartbreaking part of this job is that there are amazing projects that don't get funded every day. And I spend most of my time saying no to amazing projects. It really is just trying to find the handful of projects that can match the foundation tests, theories, and goals, and then carry it through a rigorous process to get to a small pot of money at the end that's decided by a board. And then it's coming back and sort of looking at the metrics of that grant to see how the money was spent. And I'll talk about metrics soon, because I know that's kind of a joke with how foundations are so strenuous about their metrics. But I wanted to spend a minute on this review process, because in this 1.5 years at the foundation, what I've really learned is that each of these things are set in place for a very deliberate reason. The letter of inquiry process is really an open call for anyone to seek funding from Joyce Foundation. It happens 3 times a year. Anyone can send 1 to 2-page letters in saying, here's my project, here's why it matches what you're attempting to do, which is all on our website, and here's why we think we should be funded. We do 1 to 2 pages because hopefully that's not too strenuous on the individual or the organization that's looking for funding. We receive between 75 and 200 letters of inquiry at a time. In the culture program, in my program at least, we do. And from that, we whittle that down to maybe 8 proposals that we invite, based on that preset criteria that I talked about. From those proposals, we go through a process that we call first cuts and second cuts. And that's, you know, when we kind of change our job and become defense attorneys. And we learn everything we can about the organization. We learn everything about the finances. In the art world, the fiscal year 2009 was a time where most arts organizations showed a deficit. And so we have to look back to see, where did that deficit happen? Why did it happen? Why did the, obviously 2008, the bottom fell out of the economy, but what did the organization do to recover from that, et cetera? We look at, especially since we do capacity building, we look at how an organization handles itself administratively, decisions that are made. And then we go into I don't want to mischaracterize it as like a terrible debate that we're having around the organizations. It's actually a thrilling debate that we're having, and I really enjoy being able to not be solitudinal about my job, but to talk out loud with really smart people that work at the foundation about the merit of each proposal. And then some organizations are declined after first cuts or second cuts. And the ones that make it through, we do policy papers for our board, we do write-ups on each of the projects, and then we go into our board meeting and we present, and some fall away and some make it through. And then we call everybody that day and let them know if they were funded or not. So that's the real process. It's not really thrilling or sexy, but that's the real hard work that a lot of foundation officers do to try and get funding. Metrics and outcome, that's sort of synonymous with foundation people, and hopefully you can see a little bit of where that comes from in terms of the 3-year strategy. But when I first started, there was a conversation at a board meeting that our board was asking the question if we were taking enough risks in our grant making. And the answer was a quantitative answer where, the vice president analyzed all the grant making we had done for the last 5 years to see how many we had calculated as high-risk grants and how many we had seen as a failure. And I think that we had a 30% failure rate with our grant making. And our board felt comfortable with that. That sounds right. That sounds good. And I was really inspired by that conversation, because I think in the foundation world we often push sometimes to prove our theory, and that forces our nonprofits to create fiction to make us feel good about our investment. And we all walk away knowing that, you know, what just happened, and it's a shame. And so I think that that problem rests on foundations. And so when we can translate the spirit of our board, which is, you know, I mean, maybe not seek the epic fail, which is a little bit of how I would characterize it, and I like that idea. But like, you know, go out and take big risks and seek failure, because when you encounter failure, your next step is something that's going to change the world. So I think that's on the horizon for foundations, to kind of relook at that metrics, that evaluation, that short time span to see real results. I think that this is leading into my sort of conundrums a year and a half in, but that's one of them. How do we rewire what we're asking ourselves or our partners to report on, so that we're all sort of looking for sector change? The other thing is that this is really complicated work, especially dealing with race. And the 21st century is almost marked by the inability to talk about race. It seems like it takes away from a project when we talk about the racialized outcomes of systems, like the education system or the art sector. And so one of the things that I really am challenging myself with is to figure out a new way to have a conversation about the changing demography and the implications for the arts sector that doesn't feel admonishing, but feels engaging and inspiring, and something that we can rally around together. For instance, you know, everyone was sort of shocked after the 2012 presidential election because, you know, as folks said, the Republican Party, which is 87% white, was not recognizing that they needed to broaden the tent to attract more voters. And the statistics for art museums nationally over the last 40 or 50 years has remained the same, which is about 90% white. And so I'm really wondering, what is the way that we can look at this and recognize the crisis that's happening in art museums and see it as a tremendous opportunity for a growth spurt? One of the major problems with the arts sector is that people are terribly underpaid. And you have to work an internship for free for a year or so to get into a lot of these institutions. And so what that guarantees is that the pipeline in are always people of means. And so that is sometimes racialized, sometimes not. But it's guaranteeing a certain type of diversity is not happening within art institutions. And then once you get in, institutions have been paying people, you know, to do entry-level jobs $30,000 or less, and most of those people are doing 2 jobs. So until we can really pay people extremely well to work in not just art institutions downtown, even though I'm saying in art institutions downtown, but in every art institution, when an MFA is like an MBA, then we're not going to really change a lot of the issues, and we're not going to tackle the diversity issue necessarily either. So how do we do that? And if your answer is, then just give people a lot of money to pay people more, I would push back and say, operationally, a lot of these institutions are broken. So that even if a foundation said, I'm going to give you an influx of cash, I don't think that it would go to pay entry-level folks. And then my final question for myself and for you all is about philanthropy itself. And, you know, I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but when is philanthropy part of the solution and when are we part of the problem? There is a power dynamic that I recognized as soon as I stopped being a cultural worker and started to be a philanthropist. And these poor development people have the worst jobs, the hardest jobs in the world. And are told literally to develop good relationships with foundation officers. And because of these metrics of the foundation world, there's such a fear of really saying, you know, the true challenges of the sector, that, and because our funding is sort of focused and narrow, then organizations have to stretch to meet our idea of what's going to help the sector. So what's not happening is what you guys have all the time, which is this vibrant learning laboratory. And that's really what the sector should feel like, is experiments and tests and partners that are kind of going through this together and trying to make a major change. And so is it our process? Is it our strategy? I don't really know yet, but those are some of the questions I'm asking myself as well. That's it. That's my talk.